The evening sun cast long shadows across Pine Grove's quiet streets as Officer Thompson adjusted his rear-view mirror, his partner Officer Rodriguez scanning passing vehicles with practiced eyes. Their patrol shift had been uneventful until they spotted a silver sedan with a broken taillight. Following standard procedure, they signaled the car to pull over. The vehicle smoothly came to a stop, its driver demonstrating perfect awareness of proper protocol. As they approached, both officers noticed the driver was a black woman in her mid-40s, dressed professionally in a crisp blue blazer. What caught their attention wasn't her appearance, but rather her remarkably calm demeanor, unusual for anyone being pulled over. "Good evening, ma'am," Officer Thompson began, following the routine he'd performed countless times before. "We noticed your taillight is out." The woman smiled warmly, reaching for her documents before either officer could request them. Her movements were deliberate and confident, showing familiarity with law enforcement procedures that seemed almost too natural. "Officers, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention," she replied, her voice carrying an air of authority that made both officers exchange subtle glances. "I've been so busy with the move, I hadn't noticed." As Officer Rodriguez accepted her license and registration, his eyes widened slightly. He double-checked the name, then looked at his partner with an expression that mixed surprise with embarrassment. The woman's smile grew wider, understanding dawning in her eyes. She had seen this reaction before, many times, in fact. In her 20-year career in law enforcement, she'd learned to anticipate these moments, these small instances where preconceptions collided with reality. "I see you've realized who I am," she said kindly, watching as both officers straightened their postures unconsciously. "I'm your new chief of police. I start next Monday." The silence that followed was thick with irony. Here they were, having pulled over their incoming superior officer, the very woman who would soon be leading their entire department. But what made this moment truly remarkable wasn't just the coincidence, it was the layers of meaning beneath it. Officer Thompson found himself reflecting on the assumptions he'd made in those first moments of the stop. The woman before them wasn't just any driver, nor was she just their new chief. She represented decades of change in law enforcement, of barriers broken and perspectives challenged. "Chief," Officer Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice carrying newfound respect, "welcome to Pine Grove. We had no idea you were arriving this week." The future chief stepped out of her car, her presence commanding yet approachable. "I wanted to get a feel for the city before my official start date. And I must say, I'm impressed with your professionalism. You followed procedure perfectly, even with a broken taillight." She shared a knowing look with both officers, understanding passing between them. This chance encounter had transformed from a routine traffic stop into something more meaningful, a moment that would be remembered, discussed, and learned from. "I'll get this taillight fixed first thing tomorrow," she assured them, gesturing to the broken light. "But I'd love to hear your thoughts about our department while we're here. What challenges do you see? What's working well?" What began as a simple traffic stop evolved into an impromptu street-side meeting, the three law enforcement professionals sharing insights and hopes for their community's future. The fading sunlight painted the scene in warm hues, as passing cars slowed occasionally, curious about the unusual sight of two officers engaged in animated conversation with a woman by her car. This moment, though unplanned, perfectly captured the changing face of law enforcement. It showed how a simple traffic stop could become a bridge between the old and the new, between assumption and reality. The new chief's arrival in Pine Grove wasn't just a change in leadership, it was a symbol of progress, wrapped in the ordinary circumstances of a broken taillight. News of the unexpected traffic stop spread through the Pine Grove Police Department like wildfire. By the time Monday morning arrived, every officer had heard about Officers Thompson and Rodriguez's encounter with their new chief. The story had taken on an almost mythical quality, with each retelling adding new details about her grace under the unusual circumstances. The chief arrived at headquarters precisely at 7 a.m., carrying a cardboard box filled with family photos and a well-worn coffee mug from her previous department in Oakland. Officers noticed she had chosen to park in the general lot rather than the reserved space marked Chief, a small detail that spoke volumes about her leadership style. 25 years ago, she began her first morning briefing, her voice steady and clear. "I was a rookie officer in Chicago. My training officer told me something I've never forgotten: the badge doesn't make the officer, the heart behind it does." She paused, looking around the room at the faces of her new team. "And from what I've seen so far, Pine Grove has plenty of heart." The briefing room was packed, with officers who weren't even on duty showing up to meet their new leader. They listened intently as she shared her vision for the department, but it wasn't her words alone that captured their attention. It was the way she spoke about community policing as if it were a calling rather than a job. "Last week's traffic stop," she continued, a slight smile playing at her lips. "That wasn't just a coincidence. It was a reminder that we're all human first, officers second. Officers Thompson and Rodriguez didn't know who I was, but they treated me with respect and professionalism. That's exactly what every member of our community deserves." As the weeks passed, small changes began taking root in the department. The chief introduced community coffee sessions where officers would meet with residents in local diners and coffee shops, out of uniform, to build relationships beyond the badge. She reorganized patrol routes to ensure officers spent more time walking neighborhoods and less time in their vehicles. But it was her handling of a tense situation at a local high school that truly demonstrated her approach to leadership. When a student protest over disciplinary policies threatened to escalate, the chief arrived personally, not in a patrol car but walking up from the direction of her office, her badge visible but her presence purposefully casual. Instead of confronting the students, she joined them on the school steps. "Tell me what's bothering you," she said, sitting down among them. "Help me understand." For the next hour, she listened as students shared their frustrations about feeling profiled and unfairly targeted by the school's security measures. The scene caught the attention of passing parents and teachers, their new police chief, sitting cross-legged on the steps, notebook in hand, taking notes as students spoke. By the end of the discussion, she had worked with the students to develop a plan for a student police advisory council, turning potential conflict into collaboration. Back at the station, Officer Thompson found himself reflecting on how different things felt under her leadership. The chief's office door remained open throughout the day, and she made a point of knowing every officer's name and something about their family or interests. "You know what's different," he said to Rodriguez one evening during patrol. "She's not trying to prove anything. She just is who she is." Rodriguez nodded, remembering how she had handled a recent domestic violence call. Instead of staying behind her desk, she had responded alongside her officers, demonstrating that leadership meant being in the trenches when needed. The chief's influence extended beyond the department. Local business owners noticed officers stopping by more frequently, not to check for problems but to check in with people. The farmers' market vendors grew accustomed to seeing her there on Saturday mornings, purchasing vegetables and chatting with residents about their concerns and ideas for the community. One morning, she called Officers Thompson and Rodriguez into her office. The broken taillight incident had become something of a department legend, but she had never directly addressed it with them until now. "That night taught me something about Pine Grove," she said, gesturing for them to sit. "It showed me that this department was ready for change, not because it needed to be fixed, but because it was already strong enough to grow." She shared with them her own experiences as a young officer, the challenges she'd faced, and the mentors who had helped her navigate her path to leadership. "Sometimes the biggest impact we have isn't from the major decisions we make," she explained, "but from the small moments of dignity we offer each other." The conversation shifted to their own careers, their aspirations, and their ideas for improving police-community relations. As they spoke, both officers realized this wasn't just a meeting with their superior, it was a mentor investing in their future. As they left her office, Thompson and Rodriguez exchanged knowing looks. That traffic stop weeks ago hadn't just been about a broken taillight or meeting their new chief. It had been the beginning of a new chapter for Pine Grove, one where law enforcement and community weren't separate entities but partners in creating a safer, more connected city. The chief watched them leave, then turned to look at the photo she'd hung on her wall, her graduation from the police academy, young and determined, standing beside her own mentor. She smiled, knowing that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a simple traffic stop and the courage to see people for who they really are. 3 months into her tenure as Pine Grove's chief of police, reality tested the optimism of those early days. A series of car break-ins had residents on edge, and the local newspaper ran a headline questioning the effectiveness of her community-focused approach. Some veteran officers were quietly resistant to changes in patrol strategies, preferring the old ways of doing things. The chief sat in her office late one evening, reviewing incident reports from the break-ins. The wall clock ticked past 9 p.m., but she barely noticed the time. A knock on her door frame pulled her attention away from the papers. "Chief." Officer Thompson stood in the doorway, still in uniform from his evening shift. "Got a minute?" She gestured to the chair across from her desk, noting the concern in his expression. "What's on your mind?" "Some of the older officers are talking," he began carefully. "They're saying your new approaches are making us soft. That all these community meetings and coffee chats are taking away from real police work." The chief leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. She'd anticipated this resistance, had faced similar skepticism throughout her career. "Tell me something," she said, standing to pour 2 cups of coffee from her personal maker. "What's the closure rate on property crimes since we started the neighborhood walk and talks?" Thompson accepted the coffee, his brow furrowed. "Actually, it's up about 20%. We're getting more tips, better descriptions of suspicious activity." "Exactly," she nodded, returning to her seat. "Real police work isn't just about showing force, it's about building trust. When people trust us, they help us do our jobs better." Just then, Officer Rodriguez rushed in, slightly out of breath. "Chief, you need to see this. The community center, there's something happening." Within minutes, they arrived at the Pine Grove Community Center, where a crowd had gathered despite the late hour. The chief's heart sank when she saw spray-painted words across the building's front wall, crude messages questioning her leadership and ability to protect the city. But what happened next surprised everyone. As she stepped out of her vehicle, residents who had gathered began taking out phones, not to record the police response, but to show her something else. They pulled up photos and messages from a community social media group, where hundreds of neighbors had already organized a cleanup effort for the following morning. "See this, Chief?" An elderly resident approached, holding up his phone. "We've got paint supplies lined up, breakfast donations from the diner, and about 50 people ready to help clean up at sunrise. This isn't just your fight anymore, it's ours too." The chief felt her throat tighten with emotion, but her voice remained steady. "Let's make this a teaching moment," she announced to the gathering crowd. "Instead of just cleaning up, why don't we turn this wall into something beautiful? A community mural, designed by our local kids?" The idea spread through the crowd like electricity. A local art teacher stepped forward, offering to coordinate with her students. Business owners in the crowd immediately began pledging supplies and support. As the crowd dispersed, energized by the plans for tomorrow, Officer Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. "You just turned vandalism into a community art project," he said, unable to hide his admiration. "No," the chief corrected him, "the community did that. I just gave them space to show who they really are." The next morning, the scene at the community center was remarkable. Families arrived with coffee and donuts, paintbrushes and rollers. Young artists from the high school sketched out designs that incorporated themes of unity and growth. Even some of the skeptical veteran officers showed up, trading their uniforms for old t-shirts and jeans. The chief worked alongside everyone else, her sleeves rolled up as she helped prime the wall. She moved from group to group, listening to stories, sharing laughs, and most importantly, watching her vision of community policing unfold naturally before her eyes. A rookie officer, working nearby, asked her quietly, "How did you know this would work?" The chief smiled, remembering her own early days on the force. "I didn't know for sure," she admitted. "But I've learned that when you give people the chance to show their best selves, they usually will. Our job isn't just to police the community, it's to help the community police itself." As the day progressed, the crude graffiti disappeared under layers of colorful paint. The mural took shape, a vibrant scene depicting Pine Grove's past, present, and future, with symbols of unity and progress woven throughout. At its center, subtle but unmistakable, was a badge surrounded by helping hands of all colors. Local news crews arrived to cover the story, expecting to report on vandalism but finding instead a story of community transformation. They captured footage of police officers and residents working side by side, of children adding their handprints to the mural's border, of the chief herself up on a ladder, helping to paint the highest sections. That evening, as the final touches were being added to the mural, Officer Thompson found the chief standing back, observing the scene. "You know what's really changing," he said, following her gaze. "It's not just how they see us, it's how we see ourselves." The chief nodded, watching as an older officer, one who had been most resistant to her changes, patiently helped a young child add her handprint to the wall. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of connection," she replied. "Every handprint on that wall represents a story, a relationship, a bridge built." As the sun set behind the community center, the finished mural glowed with fresh paint and fresh purpose. What had started as an act of vandalism had transformed into a symbol of Pine Grove's evolution, a visible reminder that change, while challenging, could bring out the best in everyone. The chief took one final photo of the mural before heading home, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But now she had tangible proof of what she'd always believed, that true law enforcement wasn't about force at all, it was about faith in the community's capacity to rise to its best self. The success of the community mural project sparked something unexpected in Pine Grove. As autumn painted the city's trees in brilliant colors, the police department found itself at the center of a quiet revolution in community relations. But with greater visibility came greater scrutiny, and the chief knew the real work was just beginning. One crisp morning, she received an unexpected visitor, the police chief from neighboring Riverside County. He'd heard about Pine Grove's dropping crime rates and rising community engagement, and wanted to see for himself what was happening in this small city that had everyone talking. "I'll be honest," the visiting chief said as they walked through downtown, "I was skeptical when I heard about your methods. But these numbers don't lie. How did you get the community so involved?" The chief paused to greet an elderly shop owner who was setting up his morning display. The man beamed, sharing a quick story about how Officer Rodriguez had helped his grandson with a flat tire the previous week. "See that?" she said to her colleague after they moved on. "It's not about programs or initiatives. It's about thousands of small moments that build trust. Every interaction is an opportunity to strengthen community bonds." Their walk was interrupted by a call on her radio. A situation was developing at Pine Grove High School. A student had been discovered with what appeared to be drugs in his locker, and tensions were high. The chief invited her counterpart to observe how Pine Grove handled such situations. Arriving at the school, they found a familiar scene: worried parents, nervous administrators, and a young student sitting in the office, head bowed. But what happened next surprised the visiting chief. Instead of immediately processing an arrest, the chief sat down across from the student. "Tell me what's going on at home," she said softly, having noticed the worn state of the boy's clothes and the dark circles under his eyes. The story that emerged was all too familiar: a single parent working 3 jobs, an empty house, and a teenager trying to make some money to help with bills. The chief listened, then made a decision that exemplified her approach to law enforcement. "Here's what we're going to do," she told the student. "Instead of pressing charges, you're going to join our youth mentorship program. 3 days a week, you'll come to the station after school. We'll help with homework, provide a meal, and give you job skills training. But you have to commit to staying clean. Deal?" The boys' relief was visible, but some officers present shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't standard procedure. The visiting chief watched with interest as the situation unfolded. Later that afternoon, during a debrief with her officers, the chief addressed the concerns she'd sensed earlier. "I know some of you think we're being too soft," she acknowledged. "But tell me, what serves our community better? Putting a 16-year-old in the system, or giving him tools to become a productive citizen?" Officer Thompson spoke up, sharing how his own brother had been given a second chance years ago by a compassionate officer. "He's a doctor now," Thompson said quietly. "Sometimes mercy is stronger than punishment." The visiting chief observed these interactions with growing understanding. He saw how each decision was shaped by a deeper consideration of community impact, how every officer was encouraged to think beyond the immediate situation to the longer-term consequences of their actions. As word spread about the department's handling of the high school incident, something remarkable happened. Parents began reaching out, asking if their children could join the mentorship program, even if they weren't in trouble. Local businesses offered internships. Retired teachers volunteered to tutor. The chief's office wall now displayed a growing collection of success stories, photos of young people who'd been given second chances and made the most of them. Among them was a picture of the student from the locker incident, now working part-time at the local community center, helping younger kids with their homework. One evening, as she was preparing to leave the office, she found Officer Rodriguez waiting by her door. "Chief, remember how you told us that true change happens one person at a time?" he said, holding up a letter. "This came from that kid's mother today. She wanted you to know he got accepted to community college." The chief added the acceptance letter to her wall, then turned to Rodriguez with a thoughtful expression. "You know what really makes this job worthwhile? It's not just helping people in crisis, it's preventing the crisis in the first place." Later that week, during a regional law enforcement conference, the chief found herself sharing Pine Grove's story with colleagues from across the state. She spoke about the broken taillight that had started it all, the community mural that had transformed a moment of crisis, and the daily decisions that were reshaping what community policing could look like. "The biggest lesson I've learned," she told the assembled officers, "is that every interaction with the public is a chance to either build or break trust. We're not just law enforcement, we're community builders, mentors, and neighbors first." As she drove home that evening, she passed the community center mural, now a beloved local landmark. A group of teenagers was gathered nearby, including some who had been through the mentorship program. They waved as she passed, and she noticed one was wearing a Pine Grove Police Department volunteer shirt. The chief smiled, remembering her own journey from a young officer to where she was now. Every small victory, every life touched, every bridge built, they all added up to something bigger than herself. Pine Grove was proving that when law enforcement and community truly worked together, everyone became safer, stronger, and more connected. Back at the station, she found a note on her desk from the visiting chief from Riverside County. "You've shown me what's possible," it read. "We're implementing some of your programs next month. Thank you for reminding me why I became an officer in the first place." 6 months into her tenure, Pine Grove faced its biggest challenge yet. A severe storm system had swept through the region, leaving parts of the city flooded and without power. The emergency response would test not just the police department's capabilities, but the strength of the community bonds they'd been building. The chief stood in the Emergency Operations Center, coordinating with fire and rescue teams as reports flooded in. Streets were underwater in the lower-income East Side, and elderly residents in the Valley View apartments needed immediate evacuation. This crisis would reveal whether her community-first approach could handle a real emergency. "I need all available officers on the streets," she announced over the radio. "But we're not just responding to emergencies, we're checking on every resident we can reach. Remember your community connections. Use them." What happened next would be talked about in Pine Grove for years to come. Officers who had built relationships through community policing now knew exactly which homes had elderly or disabled residents needing help. The teenagers from their mentorship program volunteered to help with sandbagging efforts. Local business owners who had gotten to know officers during community coffee sessions opened their doors as temporary shelters. Officer Thompson found himself working alongside the former drugstore owner who had initially been skeptical of the chief's methods. Together, they helped evacuate a group of seniors, the shop owner's store serving as a temporary refuge. "You know," the owner said as they carried supplies inside, "I used to think all that community outreach was a waste of time. Now I see it was preparing us for moments like this." At the Valley View Apartments, Officer Rodriguez discovered that his regular conversations with the building's maintenance worker provided crucial information about which residents needed medical equipment and couldn't be without power. This knowledge helped emergency services prioritize their response effectively. The chief herself was everywhere, directing operations from the command center one moment, wading through flood waters to help rescue stranded residents the next. Her radio crackled constantly with updates from her officers, each one demonstrating how their community connections were making a difference. "Chief," came a call from Thompson, "the high school kids from the mentorship program have organized a phone chain. They're checking on elderly neighbors and reporting back to us. They've already identified 3 urgent situations we hadn't known about." In the community center, now serving as an emergency shelter, the chief found something remarkable. Residents weren't waiting for official direction, they were organizing themselves. The same networks that had come together for the mural project were now coordinating meal deliveries, sharing resources, and ensuring no one fell through the cracks. A local reporter who had been skeptical of the chief's soft approach was recording the scene with amazement. "This isn't just emergency response," she murmured, watching as officers and civilians worked seamlessly together. "This is community in action." As night fell, the chief received an unexpected call from the state emergency management director. "We're seeing something unusual in Pine Grove," he said. "Your casualty and loss numbers are significantly lower than neighboring communities, despite similar flooding levels. What's your secret?" The chief looked out over the shelter, where officers and residents moved as one coordinated unit. "No secret," she replied. "Just relationships built day by day, person by person. When people trust each other, they look out for each other." The crisis also revealed something else, the transformation of her department's veteran officers. The same ones who had initially resisted her changes were now leading by example, their years of experience enhanced by new community-centered approaches. One such officer, a 25-year veteran, pulled her aside during a quiet moment. "Remember when I said your methods would make us soft?" he admitted, his uniform still dripping from rescue work. "I was wrong. We're stronger now, because we're not alone anymore. The whole community is our backup." As the flood waters began to recede, the chief organized a department-wide debrief. Officers shared stories that highlighted how their community policing efforts had made a crucial difference during the crisis. Each story reinforced what she had been teaching them, that true police work was about building a resilient community, not just responding to emergencies. The local news coverage of Pine Grove's flood response caught national attention. Emergency management experts began studying their model of community-integrated crisis response. But what really touched the chief was a wall of thank you notes that appeared in the station's lobby, each one telling a personal story of how an officer's previous kindness or attention had made a difference during the flood. One note particularly stood out. It was from a teenage girl who had been caught shoplifting months earlier. Instead of arresting her, the responding officer had connected her with the department's youth program. During the flood, she had helped coordinate volunteer efforts at the shelter. "You didn't just save me from making a big mistake," she wrote. "You showed me I could be someone who helps others." In the aftermath of the crisis, the chief noticed a subtle but significant change in her officers' daily reports. They weren't just documenting incidents and responses anymore, they were noting community connections, recording not just what they did, but who they knew and how that knowledge could help in future situations. During a city council meeting to discuss the flood response, the chief finally put into words what Pine Grove had accomplished. "We often talk about community policing as if it's something separate from real police work," she said. "But this crisis proved that they're one and the same. Every cup of coffee shared with a resident, every conversation with a teenager, every moment spent building trust, it all becomes vital infrastructure in times of crisis." As she drove home that evening, passing houses still marked with water lines but surrounded by neighbors helping neighbors, the chief reflected on how far they'd come from that first traffic stop. Pine Grove had shown that a department's strength wasn't measured by its authority, but by its connection to the community it served. 1 year after that fateful traffic stop, Pine Grove had become a case study in modern policing. The department regularly hosted visitors from across the country, all eager to learn how a small city had achieved what larger departments struggled to accomplish. But for the chief, the real story wasn't in the statistics or accolades, it was in the daily moments that showed how deeply things had changed. She witnessed one such moment on a sunny Tuesday morning, watching through her office window as Officer Thompson handled a situation that would have played out very differently a year ago. A teenage boy had been caught trying to steal from the local hardware store, but instead of making an arrest, Thompson was sitting with him on a bench outside, talking and listening. Later, Thompson shared what had happened. "His family's going through tough times," he explained. "He was trying to get supplies to fix their leaking roof. I called the hardware store owner, you know, the one who helps with our youth workshop program. We worked out a deal for the kid to do some stocking work after school in exchange for the materials." The chief smiled, remembering her own doubts when she'd first arrived. "A year ago, would you have taken the time to find out the whole story?" Thompson shook his head. "A year ago, I would have seen a crime. Now I see a person who needs help." The transformation wasn't limited to individual officers. The department had become a hub of community activity. The lobby, once sterile and intimidating, now hosted regular meetings between officers and community groups. The walls displayed artwork from local schools, and a community bulletin board was filled with success stories and opportunities for involvement. One morning, the chief arrived to find Officer Rodriguez organizing an unusual gathering. He had brought together local business owners, high school counselors, and former troublemakers turned mentors to develop a summer job program for at-risk youth. "The idea came from that flood response," Rodriguez explained. "Remember how those kids stepped up to help? They just needed someone to believe in them. Now businesses are actually requesting kids from our programs because they've seen what they can do." The chief's innovative approaches had caught the attention of state officials. When they requested she present at the annual law enforcement conference, she insisted on bringing a unique panel, not just officers, but community members whose lives had intersected with the department in meaningful ways. Among them was the elderly shop owner who had once been robbed 3 times in 2 months. He spoke about how regular visits from officers had not only prevented further crimes but had made him feel part of something larger. "Now I don't just own a shop," he told the assembled officers. "I'm part of a community that looks out for each other." A former gang member, now running a youth basketball program in partnership with the department, shared how the chief's approach had changed his perspective. "Before, it was us versus them," he explained. "Now we're all just working to make our neighborhood better. These officers, they're not just badges anymore. They're coaches, mentors, friends." The conference presentation had an unexpected effect. Departments across the state began requesting officer exchanges with Pine Grove, sending their personnel to learn firsthand how community policing could work in practice. The chief saw this as an opportunity to spread their message beyond their city limits. Each visiting officer was paired with a Pine Grove officer and a community mentor, ensuring they experienced both sides of the partnership. They attended community meetings, participated in youth programs, and saw how daily interactions built the foundation for effective law enforcement. One visiting officer, initially skeptical, had a breakthrough moment during a neighborhood walk. He watched as Officer Thompson defused a heated argument between neighbors not by asserting authority, but by reminding them of their shared history in the community and facilitating a conversation. "I get it now," the visiting officer told the chief later. "It's not about being soft on crime. It's about preventing crime by building something stronger than fear." The media attention brought new challenges. Some officers worried about maintaining their approach under increased scrutiny. The chief addressed these concerns during a department meeting, sharing a story from her early days as an officer. "I once had a supervisor tell me that real police work happens in the moments no one's watching," she said. "That's when our true values show. The cameras don't change who we are, they just show others what we've been building all along." The department's success attracted grant funding, allowing them to expand their community programs. But the chief was careful to maintain their grassroots approach. When a corporate sponsor offered to fund a large-scale youth center, she insisted that any new initiatives grow from community needs and input. This led to an innovative project where local teenagers designed their own youth space within the community center. They worked alongside officers, learning project management skills while building relationships that would last far beyond the construction phase. The chief's approach to leadership continued to evolve. She established a community advisory board that included representatives from every neighborhood, ensuring that department policies reflected the diverse needs of their city. Monthly town halls became forums for open discussion about law enforcement challenges and solutions. One evening, as she was leaving a particularly productive town hall meeting, she overheard two longtime residents talking. "Remember when we used to avoid going to the police?" one said to the other. "Now my grandkids want to be officers. They see it as a way to help their community." That comment stayed with her, reminding her of the bigger picture. The changes in Pine Grove weren't just about improving police-community relations, they were about transforming how future generations would view law enforcement and their role in society. The chief's office wall now held a collection of photographs documenting their journey: the broken taillight stop that started it all, the community mural rising from an act of vandalism, officers and residents working together during the flood, young people graduating from their programs. Each image told a story of transformation, not just of a department, but of an entire community's understanding of what safety and security really meant. 18 months into her tenure, the chief found herself facing an unexpected challenge: other cities wanted to replicate Pine Grove's success. As requests for guidance poured in, she realized their responsibility extended beyond their city limits. The question wasn't just how to maintain their progress, but how to help others achieve similar transformations. One morning, she gathered her leadership team for a special meeting. Officers Thompson and Rodriguez, now both promoted to sergeants, sat alongside other officers who had been instrumental in implementing the department's community-first approach. "We've built something special here," she began, gesturing to a map showing the dozens of departments requesting their help. "But our real test isn't what we've done, it's what we can help others do." The discussion that followed revealed how deeply her officers had internalized the principles of community policing. Each had stories of transformation that went beyond simple law enforcement successes. They spoke of families reunited, youth guided away from trouble, and communities empowered to solve their own problems. Officer Chen, a recent transfer from a large urban department, shared how different the atmosphere was in Pine Grove. "In my old department, success meant arrests and citations," she explained. "Here, success means knowing every shop owner's name and having community members call us before problems escalate." The chief launched what they called the Bridge Builder program, where Pine Grove officers partnered with departments across the state to share their approaches. But she insisted on one crucial element: visiting officers had to spend time with community members, not just police. During one such exchange, a visiting officer from a major city spent a day with Mr. Washington, the elderly shop owner who had become one of their strongest community allies. The officer watched in amazement as Mr. Washington showed him how the neighborhood's informal support network operated. "See that kid on the corner?" Mr. Washington had said, pointing to a teenager sweeping the sidewalk. "Used to be our biggest troublemaker. Now he's got keys to half the shops on this street. Shop owners trust him to open up in the mornings. That's what real change looks like." The chief's approach to expanding their influence reflected the same principles she'd used to transform Pine Grove. Instead of creating rigid programs for others to follow, she encouraged each department to build on their own community's strengths. "Your solutions have to come from your community," she told a group of visiting chiefs. "We can show you the principles, but the specific approaches need to grow from your local relationships and needs." The department's youth programs had evolved into a comprehensive support system. The original mentorship program had expanded to include job training, educational support, and leadership development. Many of their first participants were now mentoring younger kids, creating a cycle of positive influence. One such success story was a young woman who had been caught stealing food for her siblings 2 years ago. Now she was running a food security program that connected local restaurants with families in need, working closely with the police department to identify and support vulnerable community members. The chief's office had become a kind of informal community hub. On any given day, you might find her meeting with former gang members about youth outreach, consulting with business owners about community safety, or working with school principals on conflict resolution programs. One afternoon, she overheard a conversation between Officer Thompson and a rookie officer that showed how deeply their culture had changed. The rookie was frustrated after spending 2 hours helping an elderly resident find her lost cat. "Shouldn't we be doing real police work?" the rookie had asked. Thompson's response echoed the chief's teachings, though in his own words, "That was real police work. That woman now trusts us. She'll call us before small problems become big ones. Her neighbors saw us helping and know we care. That's 2 hours invested in community safety, not wasted on it." The department's approach to training had also evolved. New officers spent as much time learning community engagement skills as they did traditional police procedures. They shadowed community leaders, worked in local youth programs, and learned the history and culture of each neighborhood they would serve. The chief's influence extended to policy levels. She was frequently consulted by state legislators working on police reform bills, always emphasizing that effective reform had to balance accountability with community engagement. During one legislative hearing, she shared a story that captured their approach. A local teenager had been caught breaking into cars, but instead of immediate arrest, officers discovered he was sleeping in those cars, having fled an abusive home. The department worked with social services to find him safe housing and enrolled him in their youth program. 2 years later, she told the legislators, "That young man is in college on a scholarship." Traditional policing would have put him in the system. Community policing put him on a path to success. The impact of their work showed in unexpected ways. Local schools reported fewer disciplinary problems. Emergency room visits for violence-related injuries decreased. But most significantly, community surveys showed that residents felt safer, not because they saw more police, but because they knew their officers and trusted them to help. One evening, as she left the station, the chief passed the community center mural that had marked a turning point in their journey. New additions had been painted around the edges, small images and symbols representing the ongoing story of Pine Grove's transformation. A group of teenagers was gathered nearby, including some from their early intervention programs. They were showing a visiting group from another city how Pine Grove's youth council worked. The chief smiled, hearing them explain concepts she had introduced, now expressed in their own words and understanding. Later that week, during a community celebration marking the department's achievements, Officer Rodriguez shared something that touched her deeply. "You know what's different now," he said. "When I started, I thought being a good officer meant protecting the community. Now I understand it means being part of the community." The chief looked out over the gathered crowd, officers and residents mingling easily, children playing safely, former adversaries working together on community projects. Pine Grove had become more than a success story in community policing, it was a blueprint for how communities could heal and grow stronger together. 2 years to the day after that fateful traffic stop, the chief stood at the podium during Pine Grove's annual community safety celebration. The gathering had transformed from a traditional police award ceremony into a community-wide recognition of partnership and progress. Looking out over the crowd, she saw the living testament to what they'd built together. Officer Thompson and Rodriguez, now leading their own community initiatives, sat among a mix of residents, business owners, and young people from their programs. The elderly shop owner who had once feared opening his store after dark now mentored young entrepreneurs. Former troublemakers had become community leaders, their past struggles giving weight to their guidance of the next generation. 2 years ago, the chief began, her voice carrying across the hushed audience, "I was pulled over for a broken taillight." That moment could have been just another traffic stop. Instead, it became the first chapter of a story we've all written together. She paused, remembering that evening. But the real story isn't about that traffic stop, or even about me. It's about what happens when a community decides to redefine what safety and protection really mean. The celebration included a video montage of their journey, images of the community mural rising from acts of vandalism, officers and residents working side by side during the flood, youth program graduates receiving diplomas, and countless small moments of connection and trust being built. A teenage girl approached the podium to share her story. 2 years ago, she had been on a path to trouble, angry at the world and distrustful of authority. Now she stood tall, speaking confidently about her plans to attend the police academy after college. "The officers here didn't just tell us to do better," she said, her voice strong with conviction. "They showed us how to be better, by being part of our lives, not just authority figures in our neighborhoods." The chief watched as Officer Chen, who had transferred from a large urban department, presented alongside a former gang member. Together, they had developed a conflict resolution program that was being adopted by schools across the state. Their unlikely partnership embodied everything the chief had hoped to achieve. "When I first came here," Chen shared, "I thought community policing was just a softer name for regular police work. Now I understand it's actually harder, it requires more skill, more patience, and more heart. But the results are worth every extra effort." The celebration included the inauguration of the Pine Grove Public Safety Council, a permanent body of community members and law enforcement working together to guide the department's future. The chief had insisted that the council include voices from every part of the community, including those who had once been on the wrong side of the law. During the council's first presentation, they unveiled plans for a new youth center, designed and partially funded by the community itself. The architectural drawings showed a space that would house not just recreational facilities, but job training programs, counseling services, and a community kitchen. "This center," explained a council member who had once been arrested by the department, "represents what Pine Grove has become. It's not about police watching over the community or the community watching the police. It's about all of us watching out for each other." The chief's next announcement caught everyone by surprise. The department had received a major grant to establish the Pine Grove Institute for Community Policing, a training center where their methods and philosophy could be shared with departments nationwide. But, she emphasized, this institute won't be housed in the police station. It will be based in the community center, because that's where real change happens, in the heart of the community. As the formal ceremony concluded, the celebration moved outside, where food trucks and local vendors had set up around the community center. The mural that had marked their first major triumph now had companion pieces stretching down the block, each telling part of Pine Grove's ongoing story. Officer Thompson found the chief watching a pickup basketball game between officers and local teenagers. "Remember when we thought community policing meant just walking the beat and knowing people's names?" he said, shaking his head with a smile. "Now look at us," she replied, gesturing to the scene around them. "Every officer is a community organizer, every resident is a partner in safety, and every interaction is an opportunity to build something better." The success of Pine Grove had begun attracting national attention. News crews were becoming a common sight, documenting what many called the Pine Grove model. But the chief insisted that any coverage include the voices of community members alongside law enforcement. "Our story isn't just about police reform," she explained to a documentary crew. "It's about community transformation. The real heroes are the residents who chose to believe change was possible and worked to make it happen." As the evening wound down, the chief found herself back at the spot where she'd been pulled over 2 years ago. The street looked different now, new businesses had opened, families walked the sidewalks after dark, and there was a tangible sense of community pride in the air. A young officer on patrol stopped to chat, not recognizing her in casual clothes. His natural ease in engaging with passers-by, the way he knew everyone's names and asked about their families, showed how deeply ingrained their new approach had become. The chief smiled, remembering her own early days on the force. The future of policing wasn't about more technology or tougher laws, it was about returning to the fundamental human connections that build trust and safety. Later that night, reviewing the day's events in her office, she came across a letter from a police chief in another state. "We've tried to implement community policing programs before," it read, "but seeing Pine Grove in action made me realize we were just scratching the surface. You've shown us what's possible when we have the courage to completely reimagine our role in the community." Looking at the photos on her wall, the traffic stop, the mural, the flood response, and countless moments of community connection, the chief reflected on their journey. Pine Grove had done more than reform a police department, it had created a new model of community safety, one built on relationships, trust, and shared responsibility. As she prepared to leave for the night, she heard laughter from the community center across the street. The basketball game had turned into an impromptu community gathering, with officers and residents sharing stories and making plans for future projects. This, she realized, was her real legacy, not the programs or policies, but the fundamental shift in how police and community saw each other and worked together. Pine Grove had become living proof that when a community decides to rewrite its story, amazing things are possible.